All right, well, let's get started. Thought I would play some really terrible 80s music here to start out, just to pump everybody up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday, when normally most of us are skipping out of work early. So I will play that again in a little while for a little quiz at the end. So welcome everybody today to CMS Philly. I am Justin Holt, contract freelance developer based in beautiful Charlotte, North Carolina. And today I'm going to be talking about front-end performance for Craft CMS websites, but a lot of stuff that will just, be for general use. Anybody can kind of, take some stuff away from this talk. Over here to start my slides. Okay, so our agenda today, I'll go over a little bit of what perceived performance versus measurable performance means, and
laptop's about to die.
How you can kind of measure. What's that?
Oh, sorry, it's another person. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So perceived performance versus measurable performance. Front-end wins, easy things that you can add in to gain a little bit of front-end performance. We'll go over some image optimizations, tools, and some techniques to do so. We'll talk a little bit about caching on the craft level, some ideas where you can just throw money at the problem of a slow website, as well as server-side stuff that you can do to improve your performance. And then we'll go over some of the benefits of these efforts and how, some of the things you can try to sell these efforts to a client. And then we'll go over some stuff on how to actually measure and benchmark these efforts. So what is perceived performance? The concept of perceived performance is performance that you can't really measure or benchmark against, but will have a perceived version of like idea of speed to the front end user. So those are things like responsiveness to interactions, like quick animations, or responses to clicks on buttons or anything like that, trying to reduce lag or jank or anything that we face and things like that, and making sure that the user of your web application or your website really feels like things are speedy. Some of that stuff is first mile optimization, so making sure that when a person just comes first to your application or your website, they're able to quickly view and see and interact with things and not sit around and wait for stuff. A good rule of thumb is that if I have to wait, be sure to tell me. So if you're going to make somebody wait for something like a loading icon or a loading indicator, a little spinner, those are the things that make a user realize that, okay, the website understood my interaction and I'm just waiting right now, as opposed to clicking on something in the screen, just waiting with no indication. Some measurable performance indexes are things that you actually can benchmark against other web applications, other websites, or benchmark against old versions before you did optimizations on a site. And those things are a lot of stuff that Google and some of the other speed indexers will measure. And those are things like your time to interactive, like how quick can you actually interact with the website when you first get to it. Your speed index, which is how your website speed ranks against other sites that Google kind of considers similar or your competitors. Your first contentful paint, which is the first time that somebody can actually see something on the website, even if it's not fully rendered out. The first CPU idle, which is the first point that the computer is able to give itself a break and start a new process, which are things like starting a JavaScript routine or something like that, versus or downloading a font or something like that. The first meaningful paint is a measurement that Google has that gives the user kind of a workable website. Things aren't really shifting around. The initial views of your images are starting to come in, your fonts are starting to load, and it's starting to look like a real web application. The estimated input latency and things like that are another kind of deeper dive that Google does to kind of measure, how quickly is your server able to respond when it's really downloading a whole bunch of stuff to the user on its first presentation. And then the one thing that, if you've ever worked with Craft, you're always going to get dinged on a speed index for Craft's time to first byte. And that's a measurement to how quickly is the web application able to respond to the very first request. And Craft really does a lot of queries up front, especially on the initial load of something. That is improving as Craft goes along, and Pixel and Tonic does more updates that should improve in Craft 4 coming up. But that's really a challenging one with Craft, is that you're going to have a lower TTFB just because of the architecture and the schema of how Craft works. So a couple easy front-end wins. These are things that really aren't specific to Craft. These are things that you can do for your style sheets, and JavaScript includes that will help browsers that are able to support this stuff, these prefetch, preconnect, and defer attributes on links and script references. And those help the browser prioritize what it's initially downloading on the first couple of things coming down the pipe. And a preload will help, especially Chrome and Firefox. When it gets an idle point, it will start to really load these in and not have to wait for other stuff to happen. And you'll see the link rel as a preload, and then this stuff on here is referencing back to a JavaScript package that will wait for the point that this attribute, or this thing to download, which is actually, this is a font style sheet from a third party, Cloud Typography. So we got to wait for how long this thing's gonna, how quickly it's gonna respond, and it's kind of a blocker, to how things are loading on your site. So the JavaScript package, which I'll reference here in a minute, will wait for that to fully render and then switch out these attributes to be, regular old link attributes. A preconnect will tell the browser to go ahead when it gets a chance and go ahead to connect to this this attribute, or this asset here, to grab it and render it when the server or the browser is able to do so. It's kind of a thing that you can do if you're doing like load things between, like load transitions between pages and stuff like that. You can use preconnect to help make those a little speedier, because when the browser gets a chance, it's going to go ahead and try to grab the stuff and save it into the browser memory, and when it needs it, it will already have it ready to go and won't have to go out and make another request. Same thing with your main style sheet and your load CSS, which is the JavaScript package that will help switch out these. Will change the rel to a style sheet, whenever it's ready. And that's a third-party package. It's called load CSS, and there's also one for load JS if you want to do this with JavaScript. And then, depending on how crucial your compiled JavaScript is, you can use a defer attribute. And that will, because anything that you're processing with JavaScript is also going to be a blocker on any other processing that's happening in your initial download. So if you've built your site with progressive enhancement and helping out, with aiming for a visible and usable application without JavaScript and enhancing with JavaScript when you can, the defer is really going to come in handy, because it's not going to block the rendering of the page or anything like that while it grabs and starts to process your JavaScript at that point, and when it's ready, it's able to use it. Another thing that doesn't take a ton of effort but gives you a really good win on the front end is critical CSS, and the concept with that is you try to determine what CSS styles are used for anything above the fold for your most commonly visited viewport sizes, and you inline those styles in the head as opposed to having it as an additional style sheet to have to download. And that way the browser is able to quickly render those styles for anything above the head, and that's going to give that perceivable performance to the front end viewer quicker and better. There are some catches to that, and I'll go over those in a second, but for Craft, there's two pretty good plugins that are free that you can add in that can kind of do this in the background for you. One is the Style Inliner, and that one will just take the reference to a style sheet and instead parse it as an inline style as opposed to a link. There's an additional one called Critical CSS, and it will actually do a little bit more and try to determine based on the page that it's being rendered on within your site what CSS is actually needed for the user's screen size at that point. Now you do take a performance hit there because you do have to do some processing, you know, as somebody comes to the site, and it's got to then go and kind of pull out styles. Normally I don't go that route because a lot of the sites that we build are really bespoke, and there's not really, aside from having the navigation at the top and more than likely a big hero, you know, it's kind of hard to determine page by page what is going to be rendered when the client's, you know, rearranging components or anything like that within there. So the approach that I usually take is, and hopefully you can see these, when I'm breaking out my style sheet partials, I will have two different style sheets. One is my critical CSS, and that's going to kind of include all of my stuff that's going to be within a normal you know, height of a viewport size, including like layout stuff for the layout, the header, and anything that could be potentially in the top. And here, you know, you can see I try to break out all my style sheets into ones that are respective of the components themselves. And then the additional style sheet is the regular style sheet that the rest of the site uses. And you know, my gulp process or whatever front end, you know, process builder that you're using is going to generate two different style sheets here. And then I'll go back using the style inliner or critical CSS. I'm able to then tell it within the head, only render the critical compiled style sheet as, you know, an inline style in the head. That way I'm not going back and forth to my layout template and cutting and pasting a bunch of styles in. As things update in here with the gulp process, or you're making changes to these components, then it's automatically carried over to this compiled CSS style sheet. Now, one thing that you'll see here, if you use Sass and you've got a lot of stuff abstracted out, like resets and variables and fonts and colors and stuff like that, if you need those and you're referencing those within these components or anything else within your critical CSS, you're going to have to include those there, but you're probably going to have to include them again in your normal style sheet, because none of these are going to compile if they can't reference back to a variable or something like that within Sass. And that's kind of a gotcha, a little bit of a trade-off here, is that you may increase some bloat when doing this, but it's going to pay off to the front end user because they're able to see stuff on the website and kind of possibly interact with it, but at least understand, you know, hey, I've actually landed on something. The website's, you know, responding to me and it's coming in pretty quick. So that's a good trade-off. Another gotcha is that if you're not doing caching, you know, caching for that particular block, then somebody's going to have to, each view to the next pages within the site, you know, they're going to have to process all of that CSS again each time. Another front end win that's pretty easy is enforcing content editing limits. And this is a setting here as an example within Craft's config where you can limit how large of an asset someone can upload within the CMS. So I just put this here to be ridiculous. Don't ever do this. It's a gigantic asset. I usually try to keep these at like maybe 25 megabytes or, you know, 100 megabytes, 200 megabytes, something like that. That way you can kind of lean the client in the right direction to not be uploading, you know, full res 2.5 gigabyte images to the CMS and then try to render them on the front end. You also want to minify everything as often as possible, even your markup. And the Craft Minify plugin, which is also free by NY Studio 107, will do that with a simple minify tag. and an minify tag, and you just kind of wrap where you want stuff to go to be minified in your HTML. It's a small win, and it may not seem like something as you look at the file size, but to the browser and to things like Google page speed, that stuff's important because stuff that's minified is then also able to be gzipped, and you're going to just have a smaller overall package coming down the pipeline to your user. So some image optimizations, tools, and techniques. Famous quote, which is not actually a quote, from Al Gore, who we all know is the inventor of the internet: "Never let your client upload raw images to the website." And that's a really good rule of thumb. Is you don't want the client to take something immediately off of a camera or off their iPhone that's super huge, has not been optimized at all, and put it on the website and display it, because all of your performance metrics are going to go down the drain really quickly. We all kind of know from web development that images and image assets on the website are your largest and always will be your largest amount of data and size of your site. So any efforts that you can put forth to optimize at build time and also encourage and optimize at upload time is going to save tremendous amounts of rendering time and download time. I usually try to start at the editor level and encourage any content editors to try to optimize as much as possible at the desktop level, and encourage them to either download Image Optimum as an application or use one of the web tools that are out there that you can upload an image and get back an optimized JPEG or something like that has removed a lot of the fluff that goes with it, to give you a better image size without degrading quality. Now, there are a couple things that we can do on the craft side that can really help with image sizing and kind of also add to that image optimization idea. One of the best things, and my screenshot is a little bit out of date, but the plugin now is Imager X. It used to be called Imager, and it's a pretty simple tool that uses some PHP processes to transform images that are uploaded to Craft or ones that are requested at the template level, that can then optimize and give you a much better version of that image. So this is an example of one that I put in place on a site I built last year, and this is the config for Imager that you can kind of tweak within your Craft site. And I have it set to do things like optimize a JPEG at 70% and optimize a WebP at 70%. Make sure my JPEGs are interlaced. Don't allow someone to upscale an image, which is taking a small image and trying to make it really big, which is going to look terrible. Not remove metadata for things, try to use the file pattern name, et cetera, et cetera. You can even like specify what type of optimizer you want to use. I kind of go with the defaults here, like JPEG Tran, but it can try a bunch of different ones to do these automatically on the fly. And like I said, you can do these both at upload time, and these settings are kind of more geared towards when you're calling on the template level, which I'll show you some examples of here in a second. One of the most important things that's pretty new, but is really starting to get coverage across most of the modern evergreen browsers, is a WebP image, and that's a new image format. I think Google started that, but it's totally open source now, and it can give you tremendously smaller file sizes for images with very low loss. So they're very lossless and they're almost tiny, and it's a great alternative to JPEG whenever a browser can support it. So Imager is probably your best option to try to integrate new WebP images to your website. And I'll show you in a second an example of responsive images, which is an HTML element now that is pretty well supported across browsers as well. And so for responsive images, I usually try to abstract things that are reused as much as possible. So I'm not, including things and rewriting stuff across different templates. So this is an example of one that I've kind of included out as like I don't think I did this as a macro. I just kind of included this as a utility, but within Craft, you're able to parse other templates with, stuff passed into it, arguments here. So you can see some of the stuff that I'm preparing for a picture element here. So I've got my initial image. I'm pulling the URL of it. I'm passing in some Craft transforms, which if you're familiar with Craft, then you can set up a bunch of different image transforms that will dynamically create new versions of these at different aspect ratios, different pixel densities, things like that. I'm passing over the breakpoints that my SRC set is going to use within my picture element. And I always try to do lazy loading as much as possible, but there's cases where you don't want to lazy load things like your images that are probably going to be in your first mile stuff that I was just talking about. Those are going to be immediately shown on the website, and it's just going to be extra processing that would happen if you're trying to say, all right, I know it's going to be in viewport, but still try to lazy load it at that point. So I'll try to abstract this stuff out, get it ready to pass over to an entry object. And on my template level where I'm doing this, then, I'm able to set these variables based on the components image or the entry image or however else you're pulling any of this stuff in. And this is another abstraction layer that makes it easy to and I always try to do this at the top of my templates. That way it's readable, everything's kind of clean, and you're able to go quickly down through the template and see where these things are used. And then this is my responsive image. So my markup is taking in a lot of these variables that I'm passing into the utility. I'm checking here if I've got breakpoints, and if I do, set up an array, merge them in, and pass in a variable to imager that's going to tell it, all right, at this point, if you're creating a WebP, here's the image quality that I want. And then calling imager is just as easy as this right here, craft.imager.transform image. You can pass a ton of different stuff into this, but at this example here, I'm only generating a WebP image. So I'm setting that transform WebP image to a variable, and then I'm calling it down here in one of the source elements within my picture and giving it the type of image WebP. And if you notice on one of my previous slides, you got to make sure that if you're on Apache, you need to put a handler in your htaccess to be able to have the browser or the server be able to say, all right, I know how to render a WebP image, or it's not going to be able to do that. And if you're using one of the older, and I'm kind of going to date myself a little bit here, the HTML5 boilerplate, that doesn't have it in there. So it's gotten me a couple times. And then you can see I'm checking if I'm lazy loading anything. If that's the case, then my SRC is actually going to be my SRC set's actually going to be a data, because the JavaScript's going to go in and switch that out. And if we don't have breakpoints, then we're going to generate this and just write out different sources. And if not, then I'll show you my abstracted SRC set here in a second. This is where you kind of start loading in elements based on the browser width and height, if you need to do it that way, but usually it's based on width. Let me get that out of the way. And then down at the bottom here, you can see we're starting to check what type of image extension are we loading. Is it a JPEG, is it a PNG, or is it a GIF? And we give it the right type attribute for our source. So you can see all this wraps up in a pretty little bow here and works automatically, and you don't have to do this on every single template that you are rendering. I also abstract out my SRC set, because in the past, before a picture element was pretty well supported, then sometimes I would still use an SRC set, as that was supported a little bit heavier. I still kind of keep it abstracted out, and you can see examples here of just some better practices for structuring your templates. A good doc block comment up at the top, setting variables based on the stuff that you're pulling in from your component or entry or however it is, and then an empty array for your src set, which then starts getting populated by looping over the transforms. And you'll remember earlier I had a list of image transform names or handles that I was passing over to the utility here. This is where I'm grabbing those in and checking to see an additional thing. Is this this thing have a transform width within my actual image transform through Craft? If so, then we need to make sure that that stuff's rendered out. And then I just loop out at the bottom and write out all of these src set attributes and go on my way. And of course, don't forget your fallbacks for your initial image and lazy load if you're doing that, lazy loading or anything like that. That way, if your JavaScript fails or is blocked or something like that, then the user still is able to see an image. And with any lazy load stuff, at the very bottom, you want to have a no script with just a regular old image writing out. And at that point, you're just writing out whatever the raw image is that's been uploaded to the website. Another bonus that Craft gives us to kind of optimize the rendering of the page, and you'll remember earlier when I was talking about time to first byte, Craft does a ton of queries, a ton of database queries whenever it's trying to render a page. That stuff will get you left and right. It will slow down your pages because Craft's going to kind of get out of the way and render out as much stuff as you're trying to tell it to do without really concern of how big of a query. And if you turn on some of the tools that Craft will give you on the template level to see, I mean, you'd be kind of blown away seeing, this one page with 5 images and a reference to a category or something like that equals 120 queries. And that's a lot of stuff that your server's trying to render there. And one thing that Craft gives us on the twig level that helps that is a concept called eager loading. And this gives you the opportunity to try to lower the amount of queries that are happening by telling Craft what to go and grab at the same time. And so this is an example here where we're querying some entries, we're doing some order by, but I'm also telling Craft that I also, when it makes this initial query, to include the images that are coming with it. And here's some image transforms that are coming down the pipeline. And the benefit here is that Craft will wrap this up into one query, as opposed to making one query to an entry and then realizing, oh, well, I've got 2 images with, let's see, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 image transforms. That's 6 queries multiplied by 2. So you've got 12 queries now that are running that it has to go and make those relationships based on just one entry. And if this query returns out 12 entries, you're just multiplying left and right and ending up with a big performance dump right there. So try to plan out as much as possible when you're making queries, what type of other stuff is going to have to be queried by this initial query, and then encourage Craft to try to wrap those up into really good queries. But what about my CSS background images? Yep, hear that a bunch. So used to, we would kind of be stuck in having to do these big hero images, and our only option 3 years ago was, okay, well, I'll just have to include that reference within a CSS style sheet, and then render it with the size and make it stretch and make it scale, and that kind of sucked because we weren't able to then take advantage of the stuff that I just talked about, dynamically creating optimized images, WebPs, etc. And of course, browser people heard that, and now we have 2 properties, object fit and object position, of course, and then background size. So this allows us to skip having to keep that stuff within our style sheet and render these assets in line within your markup, and then take advantage of still being able to use things like contain or fill or cover, which is used pretty heavily. That way your aspect ratio stays the same no matter what the size of your viewport is. So I would definitely encourage. You can see that globally this is up to 93%. And I think the screenshot was from last year, so that's probably a little higher now. And of course, IE11, nope, doesn't do it. So it's a good opportunity for you to use supports queries if you're familiar with that, and have a fallback to an actual CSS background image at that point if your browser is Dookie IE11 and you can't support it. All right, some other cautions here with image optimization is that you want to make sure that your max execution time, memory limit, and some stuff within Nginx is good to go, because you are going to be taxing the server kind of heavily when you're generating all of these dynamic images. And increase your cache durations, because as you do these, you don't want to keep doing them all the time. So once it's generated, you want to cache that as much as possible. And use your transforms intelligently. Consider how many you're generating per page, because that is extra processing power that has to happen. So caching. Easily, you can just use the cache tag on the twig side and cache blocks of content. I usually encourage you to only do this on expensive sections like loops or matrix loops or relational blocks or things where it's pulling data from another site. Don't use it to cache static text, because that's just going to cause extra rendering time, because the server is going to have to go and grab a block of that from the database versus literally just writing out the text. So never a big deal. And then there's a couple things that you can add in, which I'm not going to get too deep in, but you can use global keys or just keys, that way they don't have to be recached per page. So like, for example, if you were caching a footer or something like that that's rendered across the site, then you could cache it globally using this label, and it's only going to enter one, render of that within where it stores within the database. You can get a little bit deeper with plugin level. HTML cache is something that's it's free to plug in on the Craft side, and it will generate full rendered HTML versions of your page, and then save that, and then start to show or serve that to the user instead of the server having to reprocess the page. It works out of the box. There's no tags required, and it does it for any non-control panel GET request. The only catch there is don't use it on a form or a page that has a form, because unless you start to do some dynamic stuff with your cross-site request forgery tag, CSRF, because it's not going to work. Blitz is the granddaddy of all caching plugins. It will generate HTML versions of pages, but also adds a lot of benefits like cache warmers, storage, reverse proxy purgers. It's pretty awesome. It is pretty advanced, and it does take some setup and some maintenance and stuff like that to even get over the hump. It is a paid plugin, so it is $99, but it's very well written and is updated pretty frequently, and will give you some really heavy benefits on the caching side. But you always want to be able to bust the cache easily. Two plugins that can kind of help with that is a no cache, which is another Twig extension that you can escape content within a cache block if you're using the cache tags on the level of the template. And then CacheFlag is a plugin that will give you a dashboard box that will show you the cold template caches that can be flagged and then automatically purged if you've got a routine that does that. The next thing you can do is just throw money at it. So of course, anybody that can put their site on a CDN like Cloudflare or Amazon CloudFront or something like that is going to immediately start getting better speed gains. Those things do cost money, and will serve your site across the globe pretty much a lot quicker. You can also offload image transforms to a service called ImageX with some extra work, and then your server is not actually running all of those processor intensive image changes. They're just going to do that on a different server and then pull them back in. You can do an AWS Lambda function to warm your caches, which is the concept of not waiting for someone to actually hit the page to then generate the cache. It's already going to be there ready for them, and then they can just serve that cache page. And of course, a beefy server. A little shared server is not going to give you a good performance because you're going to be sharing resources on that server across a number of other websites that are served from that. So, you know, if this is a priority, then you want to make sure you have your own server, even if it's at a host, you know, make sure that you have a VPS or something. Allow more time for content optimizations on the editor level. Don't, you know, try to get people to think intelligently when they're creating a blog post and not rushing it up there to the site. Actually spend some time, you know, making sure that the images are quality before they're uploaded to the CMS. And with that, you want to properly scope your projects and do things like performance budgets or bloat budgets, and you know, find a really good balance between your design and the features that you're adding to the site versus how much is that going to tax the server and the rendering of the page each time. There's some stuff you can throw on the server side. You always want to gzip as much as possible, and that's just a server thing that helps decrypt, you know, an encrypted and really flattened file at the rendering time. Expires headers, max age headers, and expires on static assets. That's stuff that you can do like with Apache at the HTXS level that will cache, you know, things like your style sheets, images, audio, et cetera, et cetera. You want to reduce your DNS lookups, so don't have a ton of 301 redirects in your HTXS. That's a big no-no. You know, handle those outside with a plugin or something like that. Avoid as many redirects as possible. Usually you're probably going to have two or one where you're either rewriting www or removing www. Try to, you know, pick one or the other and, you know, rewrite very little within that, because that's stuff that has to happen on every single page render. And then e-tags is another server-side caching element that you can configure within your htaccess if you're using Apache. So the benefits, how do you actually sell this to a client and say, okay, I need to, you know, do this and you're gonna have to pay me money to do it? Improved Google rankings. It's pretty clear these days, we all know that a slow website is not gonna rank very good. It's extremely important to make sure that your website loads fast on mobile. That's the first thing that Google's going to index you on these days with page speed, and you're going to drop tremendously if you're not loading fast on mobile. Lower server and asset storage costs. So, you know, of course, if you're paying for an S3 bucket and, you know, you're paying by how much is up there, then naturally the smaller the image sizes that are going up there, that's less server storage that you're having to pay for. Of course, the improved usability is something that's a little hard to measure and prove, but you know, you're going to see that with you know, the payoffs with your business. If you use your ads like Google Ads and you know about ad quality score, a better website and a better speed index is going to give your ad quality score a boost, and your ads are going to cost less money. And that could be a really big selling point to anybody that invests $10,000 a month into Google ads. You know, if you can lower that to $8,000 with the same coverage based on 2 weeks of development work to make a website faster, then that's a huge payoff and a huge bonus for the client. And then of course you can impress your friends and family with, hey, check out how fast this website is. So how do we measure this stuff, at least the measurable things for performance? Well, the first thing you always want to look at is page speed insights or Lighthouse within the Chrome browser. And everybody thinks, you know, Google's the big bad bully, but page speed insights is going to really give you a deep dive into how Google's, you know, Spider Index is able to see your site and how it measures the speed versus other stuff. And it gives you great hints and a great list of information of things that you can change to improve your speed. Two other tools that I use pretty frequently, they're web tools, are GTmetrix, which is a third-party website, and Web Page Test, which does a ton of benchmarking and gives you reports on speed index and things like that, and things that you can change. Web Page Test does use YSlow, but you can check that out. They have a third-party tool as well. ImageX is another third-party website that will kind of give you a page weight, so it will measure like the balance of text to images on it. And then Pingdom will give you a speed test to show, you know, how fast does your site render at these different rendering points around the globe. And that's something that can really prove the benefit of a CDN. And a cool tool that I found recently is flood.io. and that really just floods a website with a ton of traffic immediately, so you can kind of see you know, how it can respond to a big boost of traffic. So that kind of wraps up. Thank you for attending today. The slide deck I have up on my site at justinholt.com, front-end performance. You can find me on pretty much any social channel, Discord, Slack, etc., Justin Holt Web. And then if you have any questions, you can email me at justinholt.com. So that awful song that I played at the beginning, and our room organizer is going to help me try to play it through the computer so you can hear it a little bit better. Thought it would be really cool with the help of Soulspace, who is a Craft partner agency, and the people that I work for mostly, to help give away a license to one of their third-party plugins, Calendar or Freeform, your choice. So if you're the first person that's able to, and I don't think anybody else is attending right now, but if organizer, if you want to go ahead and open up and try to play that. Oh, it's awful sounding. Yeah, if you could turn it up a little bit. Hopefully you can hear that. So a couple hints here. It's from a really, really bad 80s movie. Lori Loughlin was a co-star, which is kind of funny that, you know, she's kind of in the picture these days. And then the movie was really rad. So I don't think anybody's here to answer or do any live questions. So if somebody wants to pick and identify that, feel free to email me at this address, justin@justinholt.com, and I will be able to give you your pick of a free license of Soulspace Calendar plugin or Freeform Pro, which is really nice of them to donate a license to one of those paid plugins. So thank you to everyone that stayed around, and that's the end of my talk.